Okay, guys, so we are going today with part two of the civil rights reform in the 1960s conversation. And really, we need to look back to 1945-ish in order to move forward to about 1968. Here's some key terms to remember, some people, some things that we need to be able to make sure that we can discuss, describe, explain, compare, evaluate, analyze, or assess. And we're going to start. So, if you'll notice in this conversation, we are going to be discussing a few different presidents. You'll even hear Truman's name potentially thrown out there, Eisenhower for sure. We're talking about him right now, JFK, so Kennedy, and then LBJ Johnson. And that's because we're talking about a topic here, the idea of civil rights movement and civil rights reform, and it's not necessarily a linear conversation about presidents. So we may talk a little about Eisenhower, a little bit about JFK, a little bit about Johnson. So we are spanning here some different presidencies, and we want to think about the movement sort of holistically as opposed to just this happened and then this happened and then this happened. It's this idea that the response of the U.S. government to the civil rights movement is also changing and growing as the movement is changing and growing. And so here we're going to look at Eisenhower's take. And remember, I like Ike and Eisenhower's success as a general in World War II. Here he is pictured with a number of different civil rights leaders. He is, at his core, a president who is very much focused on foreign policy issues. That's his thing, right? General in World War II. It makes sense that he would be thinking about those kinds of ideas. But he believed that having a divided nation would be very detrimental to our success as a country during the Cold War and our success as a country against the Soviet Union in particular during the Cold War. And that it was important that everyone get along, that there were no rifts exposed, that the Soviet Union didn't look at the United States and see division. So he very much worried about that. He also believed that integration was necessary. He is not a segregationist. However, he believes that integration would happen naturally, that segregation will end on its own over time, that by little, segregation would end and that eventually it would be over. And so he was hesitant to do anything from the federal level that would hasten or hurry the end of segregation because A, he thought it would die out on its own, and B, he thought that that would show division within the country. It's a little bit like what a lot of Northerners and even some abolitionists, including, by the way, Abraham Lincoln, felt before the Civil War, was that slavery was wrong, but that slavery would go away on its own. Eisenhower believes this about segregation. He does, however, desegregate some places. He desegregates veteran hospitals, and he also desegregates Navy shipyards, both of which are a big deal. He will also, as we will see, when necessary, use the federal government to take action against governors in the South in an effort to protect African American rights. So his legacy here, his impact on segregation/integration is a little bit mixed. In September of 1957, we are going to see a example of Eisenhower federalizing the Guard. So typically the Guard, the National Guard, is under the control of governors, but there are examples in U.S. history where the Guard has been federalized, meaning the federal government comes in and takes the authority of the control of the National Guard away from a governor and gives it to the federal government. So September of 1957 is an example of this. A federal court had ordered that Little Rock, Arkansas, had to admit African American students to a high school in Little Rock called Central High. In the beginning, it's just 9 African American students. So what's going on here is that this order comes after Brown v. Board of Education had already made school segregation illegal. So what happens is that civil rights groups are looking for people to challenge school districts. So it's one thing for the Supreme Court to say, hey, it's illegal to have segregated schools. It's quite another to integrate those schools, okay? And remember, we had talked about that they are moving slow in the South to integrate. So if you are a African American in 1957 who wanted to go to that school, you didn't get a written invitation. You had to go and register. Well, Central High said, no, you can't do that. The state of Arkansas said, no, we don't have integrated schools. And so they challenge them in court, and a federal court says, no, Brown v. Board is established law. You have to integrate the schools. So that's why this situation occurs. The governor at the time is a racist man named Orval Faubus. He is running for re-election. He is a staunch defender of white supremacy, and he decides to use the Arkansas National Guard to prevent these students from accessing the school. And what you see here are some images of the white community that gathered to object very violently and very loudly to these kids attending school. The image that always strikes me the most is the image on the top right here, where you see this white lady in the back screaming, just screaming. That picture is on the cover of so many textbooks in so many chapters in history books. And I always wondered, who is she? Because you want to live your life, right? So that you don't end up in a picture like that is immortalized for your grandchildren and their grandchildren and their grandchildren to see you behave in such a disgraceful way. And so on Schoology, we'll see a little bit more about who she is and what her relationship is with the other young lady that she is screaming at. And it's very, very interesting. I think you'll find it interesting too. So what Eisenhower does is he will federalize the troops. He will take control of the National Guard in Arkansas. And in the beginning, the Guard is standing in front of the school telling these kids that they can't come into the building. Once Eisenhower steps in, the Guard is standing for the students, helping them get into the building, right? So, and if you have any questions about that, let me know. Whoop. I'm going to play a short little video clip about the Little Rock Nine, as they're known.
It was 60 years ago today that 9 African-American children entered an all-white high school in Little Rock after the Supreme Court declared separate schools for blacks and whites unconstitutional. Today, the 8 survivors recalled that milestone in civil rights history and said the battle is not over. Jerika Duncan is in Little Rock.
Of Central High School experience are always with me. They just sort of don't go away.
Melba Bills was just 15 years old when she became one of 9 black students in 1957 to integrate Little Rock Central High School. After an angry mob blocked them from entering the school, President Dwight Eisenhower ordered federal troops to protect them. The students became known as the Little Rock Nine.
The world came to Little Rock to see what would happen.
Minnie Jean Brown Trickey says the hate she faced 60 years ago took away part of her innocence.
One of the things I think that comes up is the fear, how we felt, and how we were so shattered.
Trickey says back then they weren't invited to the prom or other social events. But today the Little Rock Nine were welcomed back and remembered for their sacrifice and their strength, like when Elizabeth Eckford stayed composed despite numerous taunts aimed at her.
None of us talked about what it was like inside the school for 30 years.
Gloria Ray Carlmark remembered the last day of school and the message one white classmate left in her yearbook.
She wrote, "In a different age, we could have been friends."
Terrence Roberts.
Do you feel as though we're going backwards?
No, but when you think about it, we're going forward very slowly because the forces of opposition keep pushing back.
For the Little Rock Nine, they don't celebrate themselves. They instead celebrate the possibility they still represent today. Jerika Duncan, CBS News, Little Rock, Arkansas.
9 very brave students 60 years ago. That's the CBS Evening News. I'm Anthony Mason in New York. Thanks for watching. Good night.
Okay. February 1st, 1960, 4 college students will stage a sit-in at Woolworth's department store. So sit-ins were common strategies that nonviolent protesters would use in order to call attention to a specific issue. So in this case, it's segregated dining. It could be segregated buses, as we'll see with the Freedom Riders. It's a form of a sit-in. They're just going to board the bus and sit there. So it's literally just going in somewhere and sitting there. One of the things, and you'll see these videos that I'm playing, if you go to the Civil Rights Museum, they play a lot of these same videos. One of the things that they would do prior to these sit-ins and these freedom rides was make sure, because a lot of times these were really young kids, like, and I know you guys don't consider yourself kids, but your age, college age even, 19-year-old, 20-year-old people who were doing this. And you would have members of groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee or the SNCC and other groups who would work with these protesters and train them in how to respond to being spit on, how to respond to being pulled on, how to respond to being hurled insults at, right? To being cussed at, to being, called the N-word and other terms. So I'm going to play a video here where you're going to see that training. It's disturbing, and they do say those sorts of inappropriate words. So if you're uncomfortable with that, just fast forward a little bit. But it's a training video. You're not going to see videos of actual white supremacists pulling on protesters. Some of the people in the video are white, but they are members of these civil rights groups who are training people how to best respond. It's a pretty short clip. Before I play the clip, the person in the top right up here is a man named Bull Connor. If you have seen video clips of police turning fire hoses on protesters, especially young protesters, that's usually associated with Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama. He refused to abide by federal law, which was, integration. He said, damn the law, down here we make our own law. So it's not as though Southerners are enforcing lawful orders here. They are, in many cases, in direct violation of the law. And what we will see here is that public opinion starts to turn very sharply against the segregationists in the South and for the protesters, because the headlines that you see after an event like that are peaceful protesters being met with violence, not violence meeting with violence, if that makes sense. And so these groups are very good at using the headlines to their advantage, but it does take a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, if you will.
Supreme Court ruling, long ignored in the South, that bans segregation in interstate travel. The plan is for black and white volunteers to ride together on buses. Journeys that CORE calls freedom rides. The riders commit themselves to nonviolence.
I want you to think it over very carefully, and if you
believing that challenging segregation peacefully will force the authorities to act.
We would be very happy to have you embark upon this dangerous, worthwhile, significant mission.
CORE prepares the riders for the racial hatred they can expect.
Hey, you, nigga. You hear what that man said? You hear what that man said? You get back there. Get back there. Get back. Hey. Come on. Get back.
On May 4th, 1961, James Farmer leads 13 people, black and white, onto buses in Washington, D.C., bound for New Orleans. "10 days later, the bus enters Alabama. home to the largest KKK organization in America. They know the riders are coming. In Anniston, the Klan surrounds the bus, slashing its tires. Photographer Joe Postolione captures these images. The crippled Greyhound tries to escape, but a few miles out of town, the Klan surrounds and firebombs it, with the riders still inside. The Freedom Riders do escape the bus, only to be beaten by the Klan. Joe's photos bring the Freedom Rides to international attention.
Such a happy little song after such a disturbing video. One of the things that they said at the end right there is that his photos, the journalist who's riding with them, the photos bring international attention. It is hugely embarrassing. Remember, Eisenhower doesn't want to appear divided to the Soviet Union. And here the United States is preaching that they represent freedom and liberty. And all the Soviet Union has to do is point to images like that and say, really, freedom and liberty? You know, you're not better off with democracy. You're better off with us and our way of life. So if it's a battle over a different way of life, then these images are not helping the United States at all. The next battleground was interstate transportation. Political activists targeted this industry because they knew travel between states was subject to federal rather than state regulation. So states may get to decide some laws within their borders, but when it comes to interstate, like the reason why they're taking the bus through different states is that the federal government would have the right to say what is okay and what is not okay when it comes to interstate bus travels, waiting rooms, etc. So these are different freedom rides. You see the dates: April, May, June, July, August, November, December. So you can see there's a huge commitment here that these folks are making to participate in these events. Okay, so Kennedy's going to campaign on a promise of civil rights reform, but he may want to pass civil rights legislation, but he will need the help of Southern Democrats to get it passed. That's JFK with civil rights leaders on the left, and then Robert Kennedy, his brother, future presidential candidate, attorney general on the right. I'm sorry, I was blanking on what his job was. So how does he try to balance this? Well, he does appoint African Americans to government position. He gives Thurgood Marshall, the lawyer for the NAACP that we had discussed, a judgeship. So he becomes a judge. He creates something called the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, and he gets the Department of Justice involved in supporting civil rights issues. However, he also calls for things like a cooling off period after the Freedom Rider bus is attacked that we just watched a video about. He says everyone just needs to take a deep breath and calm down, while civil rights leaders like James Farmer, who we just saw, were like, absolutely not. We're not taking a deep breath. This is horrendous and we need action immediately. Eventually, he will order the DOJ, or the Department of Justice, led by Robert Kennedy, to tighten interstate commerce controls. That would be rules that govern bus rides, right? And bus segregation will be virtually over by 1962. And if we go back to this map, you can see that time period bears that out as well. Birmingham, though, continues to be the center of a lot of violence. Again, it's no accident that Martin Luther King Jr. is from Birmingham, Alabama, right? That's where he's going to operate from. He will lead a series of demonstrations in 1963 that get federal attention. He will author, at that point after his arrest, a very powerful letter that you probably still read in English class called The Letter from Birmingham Jail. Bull Connor will be the police authority down there. He will authorize the use of extremely violent force. And on May 2nd, you have a really interesting event called the Children's March, where little kids participate in this civil rights movement. Children are also horrifically involved in September of 1963 with the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, where 4 little girls are killed. short clip on that.
It was the oldest black church in Birmingham, and it was fairly large. And so it made sense that meetings would happen there, which would also make it a target. On Sunday morning, September 15th, it was Youth Day, right after Sunday school. Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robinson, Denise McNair, and Cynthia Wesley are getting ready to go into the choir.
I remember Addie, I was closest to Addie, and we would go to church picnics. Addie and I just gravitated to each other.
Cynthia Wesley was a friend of mine. She was at my school. She was a 9th grader. Just started in September. And I was an 11th grader.
I remember Denise back there always smiling, and she was the only child. And I remember Carol Robinson being quiet. She played in the orchestra at her school.
Addie Mae's sister Sarah is also in that ladies' lounge. Sarah said the last thing that she remembers is seeing them helping each other tie on sashes, and then it went dark. We're talking about an explosion that reverberates through the entire city of Birmingham. Everybody heard it.
I was at South Illerton Baptist Church, and our pastor was shifting kind of nervously across the room and said he had received word that 16th Street Baptist Church had been bombed.
I was in Sunday school class. The building seemed like it was shaking off its foundation. Fumes, smelling fumes, and getting hit in the head. I couldn't find my younger sister. Only later to find out that she was taken to the hospital. She was only 4. She was cut in the head, blood dripping down her clothes and down her face.
Reverend John Cross comes down after the explosion to go into the hole and hears moaning.
My father heard somebody saying, Addie, Addie, and he realized that Sarah was calling her sister's name because that's the last voice that she heard before the explosion occurred.
They find the bodies, and they're almost literally stacked on top of each other.
He said it looked like they had been blown together.
It devastated me. It was just so painful to know that these girls were killed at church. They had not done anything to deserve something like that.
That was enough to pull people off the fence. Kids are supposed to be safe in church. This is not supposed to happen in America. We're above this kind of thing. And so this was the catalyst to get some things moving.
Just horrific. Despite the Brown decision, and by there they mean Brown v. Board of Education, and other civil rights victories, little changed in the everyday lives of most African Americans. Nonetheless, activists continued to struggle for civil rights. In the early 1960s, the movement experienced a groundswell of support. The surge produced a dramatic shift in race relations, led to the passage of landmark civil rights legislation in 1964, and set the stage for future reforms. So here's something I just sort of want to bring this all together. We may have had Supreme Court cases. We may have eventually will have civil rights legislation to discuss. But nothing is possible here without the hard work, not just an occasional, march here and there, but the absolute hard work and people literally putting their bodies on the line for civil rights reform. Children being murdered in the name of maintaining this white supremacist, segregationist way of life. So this is very real. It's very violent. It's very scary. But it's a very real experience for many people living in this segregated South. Okay, reference there the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Here we're going to talk about the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, where he will himself go to the University of Alabama and throw himself, that should say attending, not attuning, throw himself in front of the door and say, you can't come in. So it's not just that he sends troops to prevent the University of Alabama from being integrated. He himself physically goes to prevent the University of Alabama from being murdered. Medgar Evers, who's a noted civil rights activist, will be shot and killed in his driveway when he gets home while his children watch from the window. And there is a really powerful video right here. So this is George Wallace, and he's going to talk about his commitment to segregation. Now, George Wallace will be shot, not in the video, so don't worry. He will be paralyzed, and he will change. But right now, he is very much a segregationist. So here's what he has to say.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us, and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Think about who he's saying he represents, right? Is it the people from, the great state of Alabama, or is it a very specific group of people within the state of Alabama? He's the governor, right? But he's not representing everyone. Kennedy will announce plans for the Civil Rights Bill that he plans to pass. He will announce plans for that in 1963. There is a March on Washington that you guys know about, and also in 1963. But it will be Johnson who will eventually get the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. Despite a filibuster in the Senate, it essentially makes segregation illegal in public places, provides equal access to facilities, empowers the Attorney General to bring lawsuits to force states to end discrimination, and makes that Equal Employment Opportunity Commission permanent. Johnson is at his heart a legislator. He's also a Southerner. He's from Texas, and he was much more able to work with Democrats than Kennedy.
Today,
during the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement made great strides forward, yet racial injustice was not fully eradicated. Frustration with the situation led some African Americans to turn to more radical and sometimes violent methods. They're setting us up here. This is a quote from the textbook, setting us up to discuss Malcolm X. In 1964, the 24th Amendment is ratified. It will eliminate poll taxes for federal elections only. So states couldn't charge you to vote anymore. It's crazy to think that that used to be a reality, but it did. And so even though federal elections have their poll taxes eliminated, just having basic access to the ballot box remained a significant struggle and issue for African Americans. In Selma, Alabama, for example, African Americans are the majority, but they comprise only 3% of the voting population, which is just a crazy discrepancy. Now, why might that be? There's a sheriff in Selma, Alabama, named Jim Clark, and he uses violence and intimidation to prevent African Americans from voting. There will be a series of protests in Selma and a march from Selma to Montgomery, which is 50 miles. Along this march, the police and just regular people meet them, throw things at them, beat them up. It's known as Bloody Sunday, and it's televised. So again, think about how television is changing the civil rights struggle. It's going to lead to the Voter Rights Act of 1965. Ultimately, almost 300,000 African Americans will become new voters, and many African Americans will be elected to Congress. So this is really the first time since Reconstruction that we are seeing African Americans come back to Washington, D.C. as lawmakers. Oh, I thought that was going to get bigger, but it did not.
600 people gathered at Brown Chapel AME Church on Sunday, March 7th, to begin the march to Montgomery. Dr. King was preaching in Atlanta. Hosea Williams and John Lewis led the march. Lewis chose to march even though his organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, opposed SCLC's strategy and decided not to take part. Surprisingly, as they walked through the center of town, there were no police in sight. The route out of Selma crossed over the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
It'll be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You have to disperse. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue.
President Johnson, sensing the mood of the country, addressed Congress on national television.
What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is
8 days after Bloody Sunday, 4 days after Reeb's death, the president asked for a comprehensive voting rights bill and astonished the nation by using the words of the movement.
Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Judge Johnson has just ruled that we have a legal and constitutional right to march from Selma to Montgomery.
The judge's action cleared the way for the march, but Governor Wallace still refused to provide the necessary protection. So President Johnson federalized the Alabama National Guard. Sunday, March 21st, only 62 days after the campaign began, 3,200 people gathered at Brown Chapel Church for the journey to Montgomery.
We are going to walk non-violently and peacefully to let the nation and the world know we are tired now. We've lived with slavery and segregation 345 years. We waited a long time for freedom. We are trying to remind the nation of the urgency of the moment. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to transform Alabama, the heart of Dixie, to a state with a heart for brotherhood and peace and goodwill. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children.
We're marching on to freedom land. We're marching on to freedom land. 'Cause our strength from day to day as we walk the narrow way. We're moving forward. We're moving forward. One day we're going to be free. We're marching on the freedom land.
54 miles and 5 days marching. They were now 25,000 strong.
Marching together and listening to Martin's speech.
We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. That will be a day not of the white man, not of the black man. That will be the day of man as man. However difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed earth will rise again. How long? Not long. Because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. How long? Not long. Because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's trampling out the village where the grapes of wrath are stored. He's loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
So here is just some charts for you, a little bit of a timeline to show you where we are in terms of African American civil rights voting. You can see how voting registration increases in some of these southern states from 1964 through 1968, and a lot of that is due to the Voting Rights Act and, of course, the work of civil rights leaders. Here is an example of ensuring that people are actually allowed to vote, observers. This is in Tuskegee, Alabama. Attitudes, of course, don't change overnight. Legislation doesn't change the reality of poverty and discrimination that many African Americans will still face. We will see a series of riots in Los Angeles, Detroit, Nashville, leading the federal government to establish something called the Kerner Commission. The Kerner report comes out in 1968. Essentially, the federal government is saying, why is there violence and rioting going on in some of these larger urban areas? And the report finds this is a quote, "Our nation is moving towards two societies, one white, one black, separate and unequal. That poverty is growing, that discrimination is continuing, and that something has to be done." Dr. King had become extremely involved in what was going on in Chicago, even participated in the negotiations with the mayor of Chicago. And it seems, although he's killed before he can, it seems that this issue of urban poverty is his next sort of hill to climb. This is an image of the race riots in Detroit, where neighborhoods, African American neighborhoods, are burned and destroyed. All right, we will continue this conversation.